Good evening, everyone. This is an exciting time to be joining us with the Education Trust this evening. I am Tangi Reed Marshall, the Director of Practice at the Education Trust National Offices. And this evening, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to host our book talk for my colleague, Karin Chenoweth, on the new release of her book, Districts That Succeed, Breaking the Correlation Between Race, Poverty, and Achievement. I want to begin laying the groundwork for the conversation and really think through with you and share what we have come to understand and believe about the state of education for African American and Latino, Latinx children across the country. There's a familiar story. We've heard it for decades. And the story is that African American children and Latino children are perpetually underperforming compared to their white and some Asian communities. We also have heard that the zip code in which a child finds themselves is a strong predictor of that child's outcome from high school and whether that child will have enough opportunities to launch them to a future that is secure and that is productive. What Karin has been able to do in her work is really begin to challenge those familiar tropes and really think through and learn about districts that are succeeding in places where we would not expect them to succeed. And I know that's a very interesting thing that we say that schools might be in places where they might not succeed well, but Karin's work is going to shine a light on that. And to begin our discussion, I want to introduce to you who you'll be hearing from tonight. You'll be hearing from Alia Wong. She is an award-winning reporter based in DC who covers inequities in education for USA Today. She's also working on 2 in-depth reporting projects, one through the Woodrow Wilson Higher Education Media Fellowship, and the other through the Brickner Center for Freedom of Information's Reporting Fellowship. We will also be joined by Dr. Janice K Jackson, former Chief Education Officer for Chicago Public Schools. Dr. Jackson, a recognized leader in the field of urban education, was named Chief Education Officer for Chicago Public Schools in July 2015. A self-described progressive educator, she believes that high expectations and equally high levels of support must be provided for all children. In her role as Chief Education Officer, Dr. Jackson leads the entire academic arm of CPS, which included 660 schools in 13 networks and is the 3rd largest school district in the country. And then we will hear from the author herself, which is going to be very exciting. Karin Chenoweth is a longtime reporter who became an education writer when her 2 children began public school. Since 2004, she has worked at the Education Trust, a national education advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. During that time, she has authored 2 books and co-authored a 3rd about high-performing and rapidly improving high poverty and high minority schools. She now writes regularly about schools and education for Huffington Post and other publications. In October 2013, she received the Millman Award for her contributions to education research. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to turn the rest of our conversation in a moment over to Karin. Throughout this time together, if you are so inclined, please be sure that you use the Q&A feature on the webinar to ask questions. We are reserving time at the end of our program to engage you with your questions. If you'd like to tweet out, please do so at #DistrictsThatSucceed. You can also do an @USA Today, and you can also do an @Janice Jackson. So please join us this evening in welcoming Karin, who will then work with Dr. Jackson and Alia Wong.
Hi, this is Karin. Am I muted? Nope. So I just want to thank Tangi for that wonderful introduction, and Dr. Jackson and Alia Wong for joining us tonight. I'm just going to read a little bit from the book. I promise not too long. Some people don't like to be read to, but just to give you a sort of sense of the book, so it'll whet your appetite and want to go read some more. So in terms of outward appearances, there's not much to connect the districts I've profiled in this book. Chicago, Illinois, Steubenville, Ohio, Lane, Oklahoma, Cottonwood, Oklahoma, Seaford, Delaware, and Valley Stream 30, New York. They're wildly different in terms of size, demographics, locale, available resources, and lots of other ways. But each one in some way breaks the correlation between students' background and achievement. That is to say, they all serve students of color and students from low-income backgrounds, and they're all high achieving or improving. To find them, I followed the advice of educator and education researcher Ronald Edmonds, who wrote, first, you identify schools that produce the outcomes you're interested in. Then you watch them and try to figure out what makes them different from ineffective schools. He was talking about schools, and in this book, I'm looking at districts, but the principle is the same. The outcome I was interested in was academic achievement of students of color and students living in poverty, and the districts I profile in this book are clear outliers. The question is, what makes them more effective than similar districts? It would be nice if we could discern one easily identifiable factor, or even two or three. Maybe it's passionate, hardworking teachers, a coherent reading program, a particular set of assessments or student management programs, or maybe a particular grant program. As nice as it would be to boil the success of these districts down to a couple of those things, I don't think the answer lies in that direction. After all, there are plenty of passionate, hardworking teachers in ineffective districts, and the same can be said about good reading programs, assessments, data systems, and grant programs. What distinguishes these districts isn't anything that easy. Rather, I think it's an ethos, to use the word Sir Michael Rutter used to describe effective schools in 1979. What does that ethos consist of? It's hard to beat Ronald Edmonds' phrase, a culture in which it is incumbent upon all personnel to be instructionally effective for all pupils. But what does that mean in more concrete terms? First, and possibly the most important, is leadership. Each of the districts has school and district leaders who believe in the capacity of schools to make kids smarter and who work relentlessly to ensure that they do. None of the leaders in this book is a fluffy utopian idealist. All are hard-headed career educators who have seen the power schools have to change lives. As Melinda Young, superintendent of Steubenville City Schools, said, the truth is, you can really see it, and it's exciting when you see the breakthroughs. They all know, as she said, that they can change the path of poverty. That doesn't mean they think it's easy to educate all children. In fact, they know it isn't. So they've had to think hard about how to lead improvement. And what they've all realized is that that process comes down to a lot of people learning to make better decisions over time. So let me just talk about Chicago just for a minute. Chicago Public Schools is one of the few districts in the country that grows students 6 academic years in 5 calendar years. That is to say, when Sean Reardon, professor of poverty and inequality in education at Stanford University, did an analysis of districts across the country, what he found was that the average 3rd grader in Chicago was more than a grade level behind the national average, but the average 8th grader was pretty much at the national average. No other large or even medium-sized district can boast that its students improved that much from 3rd through 8th grade. When Reardon first unveiled this analysis in 2017, he shocked the education world. Few expected a city where 89% of students are children of color and 80% come from low-income backgrounds to be among the top 5% of the nation in elementary school gains. On videos of his talks, you can sometimes hear audible gasps of disbelief when Reardon got to this part. Sometimes Reardon would say something like, I know, I didn't believe it either, but I reran the data and it said the same thing. The University of Chicago Consortium on School Research spent 20 years studying schools in Chicago, and they studied schools that improved and those schools that didn't improve. And they confirmed Rutter's and Edmonds, what they said was that schools improve as the result of people working together cooperatively over extended periods of time to develop coherent instruction and build a culture of improvement. So that means involve families, supportive environment, ambitious instruction, effective leaders, and collaborative teachers. When schools had all 5 of what they called these 5 essentials firmly in place, they were 10 times as likely to improve than if they didn't, the consortium found. In fact, 3 of the 5 would do it if one of them was an effective leader. Janice Jackson, the former CEO of Chicago Public Schools, is adamant that key to Chicago's improvement is its transformation of the role of the principal. If I were giving advice to other districts, she said, I would pay attention to school leadership because it can have a dramatic impact on performance in the school and the district. Most of the examples in this book are small districts, and you could argue somewhat obscure. I thought Steubenville might have caught the interest of Ohio education professors, but when I called a bunch of them, they were politely baffled that I would think to ask them if they or their colleagues had spent any time trying to figure out why one of the highest poverty districts in their state was also one of the highest achieving. But Chicago is neither small nor obscure. Its improvement has been thoroughly documented by some of the most respected education researchers in the country and validated by multiple sources of data. And yet its improvement still comes as news to people who would normally be expected to pay attention to such matters. The question is why? After all, a huge, politically dysfunctional district, despite being perennially starved of resources, has slowly, steadily made improvements that help more kids learn and find their way through high school and into college at rates that are very comparable to the rest of the country. How is that not a major story? There's no question that CPS still has enormous problems. The 4th largest district in the country has plenty of failure and dysfunction that needs to be talked about and fixed. But it poses a challenge to American education. Chicago is a clear example of a piece-by-piece rebuilding of a massive public institution with more improvement than any other large school district. In many ways, it represents a triumph of democracy that can give heart to all those who fear that America can no longer solve problems and aspire to big things. But its story has largely gone untold, and I suspect that because Chicago's school system is so connected in the public mind with African-American children as well as African-American teachers and principals, the public will continue to be suspicious of any news of improvement. Even Americans who don't consider themselves to be racist openly doubt that a system serving primarily children of color from low-income backgrounds and taught and led by educators of color can improve in any substantial way. That the largest student enrollment group in Chicago is now Hispanic will not be likely to change minds about a district that is more than 80% Black and brown. And this means that the nation is allowing racism to blind it to pathways forward in improving schools. I wrote this book hoping to counter such pessimism. The districts I have profiled in this book provide clear arguments against the idea that public schools are incapable of improvement and excellence. They demonstrate that our future fellow citizens, children from all backgrounds, are capable of getting smarter and that the efforts of ordinary educators, when marshaled together, can help them do so. Kids can get smarter, we can all get smarter, we just have to muster the will to do so. So now I turn it back over to Alia Wong and Dr. Janice Jackson. I'm so excited. I can't wait to hear them talk.
Thank you, Karin. What struck me as I read this book, and particularly the chapter on CPS, is that school reform, breaking the correlation between race, class, and underachievement, it's as simple as it is complicated, right? So many of the strategies that underpin Chicago's success, and Karin alludes to the same point, they're almost too obvious. Effective visionary leadership and collaborative teaching are key, Decisions are driven by data, schools establish a culture of high expectations, and so on. I don't think anyone would deny the power of this recipe, but that's where things get tricky. Which is why I'm so delighted that I get to grill one of the masterminds behind Chicago Public Schools' modern day success story. I should note that CPS is in no way perfect. I would be remiss not to mention that as a journalist, but even the skeptic in me can't deny that its strides in the past decade or so are truly remarkable. And Karin just gave some examples of that. And I think many of us here today would agree that those successes are largely underrated. So without further ado, let's dig in. Dr. Jackson, could you spell out in concrete terms and with some examples, some of the major contributors to Chicago's upward trajectory?
Yeah. First, thank you guys for having me here. And again, I'll talk about things that I've gone on the record about, but I do want to lift up that first point around it seeming like common sense. And if you go back to Ron Edmonds' work and work that has built off of that around effective schooling, they are really simple things. And if you think about your own schooling experience, if you had a successful one, this is the recipe. And I really want to lead with that because I think oftentimes when we try to address, am I breaking up? Someone just said it's breaking up in the chat. Am I breaking up, Alia?
No, you're fine, Dr. Jackson. You're fine.
Oh, okay. Sorry about the distraction. So I was going to say, it is simple. And I think oftentimes when we start to think about how to address some of the issues in public education, in particular, as it relates to Black and Brown children, people want to try all these newfangled things and experiment, for lack of a better phrase, on our children. And so folks are listening to this webinar. I think the first thing I want them to know is that the things that work for all children to learn and have a successful educational experience work for Black and Brown and low income students. That's my first point. But in particular in Chicago, and Karin lifted this up in her remarks earlier from the book, I really do think the focus on principal leadership has been critically important for us. If you think about a large district like CPS with, over 40,000 teachers and employees in our buildings, it's hard to manage that centrally. But with 650 principals, you can put together a coherent program around sourcing talent, bringing them into the district, training them, placing them in the, right schools to have the biggest impact. And that's been a public-private partnership that has gone on for over 15 years, maybe even closer to 20. And so I think people should know that a lot of these efforts are long-term efforts. When Sean Reardon's data came out, it felt like this came out of the blue. But if you've been working in CPS, you've seen all these pieces come together. And someone like me that was both educated in the district and also working in the district, I can see how all these pieces come together. I also have the comparison to what CPS is today and what it was 30 years ago. The last point I would add on is, and this was highlighted in the book as a major theme, is the effective use of data. Student achievement data, we're not afraid of it in CPS. It is just as controversial as it is in other places, but I think strong leadership from either our mayors, the mayors that we've had, as well as superintendents around looking at how students are performing, sharing that data publicly, and also ensuring that people are held accountable to move that data forward has been both a hallmark of what we do here, but also been a source of criticism for a lot of people. But I've gone on record time and time again to say, I think the biggest thing we can do to disadvantage students is to pretend and not tell them how they're performing, knowing that when they turn 18 and go off into the real world, they will be judged by test scores. They will be judged by their grades. And so why would we tell them those things don't matter? Because we want to feel good as adults about the work that we're doing when we know opportunities will be locked out or unavailable to them if they don't meet certain standards.
I hear I'm breaking up a little bit, but can you hear me now?
I can hear you. It's
okay,
breaking
good.
up, but I'm making out what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, good. I want to talk about one initiative in particular that I've reported on, and I think that's gotten a lot of attention because it has had such an impact, is the Freshmen on Track.
Yeah.
Maybe explain for people who don't know about it briefly what that entailed, and then go on to explain why it was so pivotal to the success that we've witnessed in Chicago.
Yeah, I thought you were going to explain it. I was about to be impressed, but I'm sure you could. So first,
I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, well, this is another key piece to the Chicago success story is our partnership with the University of Chicago's Consortium on School Research. And as many people here know, and maybe not as much nationally, this is one of the few partnerships where they have unfettered access to student data in CPS, and they've had it for 30 years. So about 20 or so years ago, they basically came to the district, and we have countless examples of this. They came to the district and showed us this data that students who were on track by the end of 9th grade were 3 times more likely to graduate in 4 years than their peers who weren't. And this is another example, Alia, of like empowerment as an educator, because I was a principal at this time. And for the first time, and I'm a principal, so I've already been through my teaching experience and starting a school. This was the first time where I felt truly empowered to do something about a student metric. It was clear. The teachers and the educators in this building, we can do something about ensuring that all of our students are on track by the end of the year. And so we set up early monitoring and warning systems, supports for students. We started the first of what's really common now in CPS PLCs, where we looked at data. And, there's countless research and now even a book out about how that's been transformational. But it wasn't just about the research. The research was incredibly important and correct. But more importantly, it was the empowerment piece. Leaders felt like they could do something about that data. Sometimes it's hard when you get test scores because you feel like, oh, it's hard to move it, even though we have, as Karin pointed out. But this felt like something that was within our control.
Is the improvement in Chicago widely recognized within the field of education? As I mentioned earlier, it seems like a really underrated success story. And I also wonder if you've seen lessons of that story being applied elsewhere.
Yeah, the best thing I can say, it's a complicated story. It's definitely a success story. And anybody who's heard me speak knows that I'm the biggest cheerleader. And, I set about making sure people understood this for a variety of reasons. But I think Karin hit it on the head earlier, and I'm so glad she was honest about that. The honest to God truth is that people don't believe Black children can make these type of changes. That's the bottom line, because anybody else, the data from Sean Reardon, the Council of Great City Schools has highlighted our data. NAEP, the nation's report card, Chicago Public Schools stands out. And even here locally, University of Illinois did a study called Upstate Downstate. People can look it up. It had a longer title, but that was a short version. And basically what it showed is that when you compare every subgroup of students in Chicago Public Schools with their peers throughout the state in Illinois, they outperform them. So low-income Black students in Chicago outperform low-income Black students across the state. White, affluent students in CPS outperform. So why is this not recognized? And I think that it has a lot to do with, people's opinions about the city. I think it has a lot to do with anti-Blackness, to be honest with you, because people say they're concerned about the opportunity gap. They say they're concerned about these disparities that continue to show up in education. But this book points out several examples that if people are really concerned about it, they should be looking at that and figuring out how can we replicate that in other places. However, that doesn't happen. People are much more comfortable being skeptical around it. And anybody who's seen that data and has been skeptical, you have to do your own self-analysis and unpacking around that. Like, why is that? And I've even seen teachers, not necessarily classroom teachers, but like the teachers union leadership here do that. And I'm thinking, like, this is your data. The teachers in the schools created these outcomes by working with the students and the students meeting these goals. And so why aren't we celebrating that? And I think the answer again comes back to anti-Blackness and politics, being given precedent over everything. And unfortunately, that seems to be a part of the American culture now. We see that happening with the pandemic. People are putting politics over their own health, their lives, their families. And I think we have to do away with that because it's ruining our education system.
On that point, I think CPS really epitomizes this really entrenched stigma about You know, there's a stigma against urban schools, and we see white flight out to the suburbs. How do we break that stigma?
Well, I approach that in two different ways. Number one, and this has been a source of criticism, and people can weigh in on this how they feel, but we've actually seen less white flight in CPS because of the improvements in our schools. There are countless schools, that I could name that people wouldn't have attended 20 years ago. Now they're the most sought after schools, and it's not selective. These are community schools, and people have relocated to the city to attend our schools. So that's a source of pride and an accomplishment. But I'm more proud of making improvements for the residents who have been here for generations. And that's a place where we still have a lot of work to go. We celebrate these improvements, but when we still look at the data, there are still glaring disparities. There are still disparities in the opportunities that kids get based on where they live and what schools they attend. And so we still have a lot of work to do to achieve greater equity. But in my opinion, I think, and everybody's different. I'm not an elected official. I'm not a mayor. A mayor may have to worry about this more. I'm not worried about white flight and who comes in a district and who leaves. That's not my concern. I'm worried about the people, white, Black, Latino, poor, middle class, who rely on a public school system and making sure that that school system is strong. And in most cases, Black and brown and low income people rely on the public school system. So if I can make them proud, that's all that matters to me. And it's an added bonus if it becomes good enough for white people not to leave the city.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
So there's been a huge change at the top of CPS. Obviously, lots of changes going on right now. How can the district maintain its momentum moving forward, especially in the immediate future?
That has been the biggest conundrum, or I guess mystery around this continued and sustained progress, because there has been a lot of change and turmoil and turnover at the top. If you look at the tenure between, when we first started with mayoral control in the mid 90s until today, of course, there have been a couple of periods with Paul Vallis, Arnie Duncan, where, superintendents had a much longer stint. I would also mark that those days were before social media. And I hate to say it, I hate to even give social media that much power, but I do think that the role of principalship and superintendent has evolved from what it was, 3 or 4 decades ago. I think it has evolved in the past decade with the advent of social media, the 24-hour news cycle. It's much more political, and this played out. I don't want to go too far down the road on this because it'll take up more of our time, and we're here to talk about the book. But if you think about the reopening challenges, and unfortunately it's spiking up again, the way schools have been politicized, it's never been like this before. And I think that it becomes even more heightened because of the way we get our news, the fact that we're constantly getting news over and over again. And so that's something that I think we need to think about. But in large districts, let me say this, the principals are the most important players in all of this, because we have had greater stability with our principals. And that's a piece that, I think could have been lifted up in the book more. I know Karin talked about it, but a source of pride is that in 2015, 75% of our principals remained each year. That meant a quarter of our principals were cycling out. That number is over 90% now. That is one of the key reasons why, because principals create the conditions for change and momentum, and sometimes the disruption if it works in the opposite direction in schools. And so I think that that's critically important. But my advice, I think last year was hard on everybody. I think superintendents in particular, because there was no real support network. It was hard for teachers, it was hard for principals, incredibly difficult for parents and students. But I don't think there was a social network for people who were really in the nexus of everything. And like everybody, trying to make decisions about stuff we had no idea what was going on, and it was changing day to day. And that's why I think you've seen a large exodus of superintendents across the country. At least that was my experience. And quite frankly, and I've said this publicly, another reason for me is I'm not comfortable with the politics in public education. I'm just not. And I think the way our kids are in Chicago in particular, I'm not just referring to the pandemic, but the way our kids are used as pawns to get things and pulled out of school, I could no longer preside over that. Since I've been in the chief ed officer role, we've pulled kids out of school for strikes multiple times. We had kids out of school for the pandemic. They didn't go back when they needed to, again, because of politics. And it was just too much to bear. And as a person who grew up knowing that education changed my life, I couldn't be in a position of power and allow that to continue to happen. What's the point of this job if you can't control that? And in Chicago, the CEO can't control that.
And speaking of school politics, what is your advice to district leaders and principals as they reopen schools this fall? Particularly, with regard to the closing disparities. Let's focus on the
Yeah, I think, my heart goes out to all of the educators going back. I don't feel like, anybody got a real break this summer. There was a glimmer of hope early, in late June and part of July. But the way, the variant is spiking up and all these issues are rising, it pains me that most of the debates and, school board meetings and things like that across the country, they're talking about to wear a mask or not to wear a mask, when the real debate and energy should be around, let's debate ideas around how we help these kids get back into school and how we help them recover after their educational experience has been disrupted for over a year and a half. That's all we should be talking about. And I don't think anybody's really talking about that. There are, of course, districts that are doing better than others who are focusing on how they're going to bring kids back into school and help them recover academically. But most superintendents, I think, are frustrated because they're spending their time on political BS, no better word to put in there, when really they signed up to help kids learn and to help kids reach their potential. And they're spending a lot of time on communications, crisis management, and managing adults.
My next question relates to another debate that is probably sucking up a lot of air, or you would argue is sucking up too much air, but that's this pushback against quote unquote divisive concepts. And, that's become sort of the legislative way to describe critical race theory. So what are your thoughts on what's going on right now? And how can schools kind of break through that noise and continue doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah. Well, the good news is I think most schools will continue to do just that. One of the reasons why I think we've made a lot of progress in CPS is we did adopt the Common Core standards, which I know was, again, politicized and wildly controversial. But again, drawing on my own experiences, it really did change how we thought about what students needed to know and be able to do. In the same way, making sure there's a focus on culturally relevant teaching. Now, what has happened with critical race theory, or CRT, which I don't even really like to use that acronym, people conflate the two, and I think they do it intentionally. So my first advice to people, I saw this on Twitter, like if somebody brings that up, just ask them what it is. First, make sure they know what they're talking about, because in most cases, people don't know what they're against. That's number one. But if we're talking about culturally responsive teaching, if we're talking about making sure that kids have windows and mirrors in the classroom, that they read works that speak to them while also having access to the canon, I'm a big believer in that. I think that works. I also think we do have to be honest about the history of America. I am a history major, former history teacher. And when I read 1619, and I've read a lot of stuff about history, it did change me. And I like to think that I was more on the progressive side of history. And I just think that we can't walk away from that. That is part of our history. That's part of this country. And it doesn't have to be a negative thing if we're all interested in healing and moving forward. I don't think anybody who raises up critical race theory or culturally relevant teaching or whichever one people want to take on, is trying to destroy America. I think they're trying to improve America. They're trying to make it so that we have an honest, reflection on our past, so that we can move forward and actually trust one another and have a stronger country. And so Chicago Public Schools will continue and always be a place where we talk about the tough issues. And I think that's one of the reasons why you've seen the progress here, despite the turmoil and the fighting that plays out for everybody's entertainment on Twitter. We're not afraid to be bold and, teaching around culturally relevant teaching. We did a reparations 1 curriculum here that was based on like a nasty history of police brutality. I mean, we were doing this stuff before it became, popular, to use a kid's term, to do it. And I know Chicago Public Schools will continue to do it. And I'm just encouraged that so many other districts are as well.
And I would venture to say, that emphasis on culturally relevant teaching is one of the factors behind what's the progress that's seen in reading proficiency, right?
Absolutely.
When you're giving students reading materials that are relevant, that are engaging, that force them to think critically.
And they get into it more when those are social issues, because it actually matters to them. You try to teach them something that happened, 200 years ago. The old version of history was, getting too wonky here, but big man history, which is like we focus on an incredibly important or brilliant white man. And, I grew up, I love that history. That's how I got into it. But I was usually the only Black girl. And I know when I was a teacher, I was the only Black woman as a teacher. All the other teachers were white men for the most part. And so if we really want kids to embrace that, we have to connect it to their lives. And I think that's what culturally relevant teaching does. And so the new curriculum that the district is rolling out, Skyline, beyond being on grade level and rigorous with supports for students, it also provides culturally relevant access points, as well as support for students with disabilities, as well as our students that are learning English as a second language. And to me, that's equity. What happens in the classroom where kids spend majority of their time, that's the real equity, and we should be paying attention to that more. Aaliyah, I think you're frozen. Okay, you're back on.
I'm back. Oh, that scared me. I hope you finished your thought. Did you?
I did.
Okay.
Yep, we're moving. Uh-oh.
So I need to ask you, what are your next steps?
You know what? You were frozen until you said next steps. So I
knew
should
that
pretend
question.
I should pretend like I didn't hear it anymore. But okay, I see some of the questions. No, I'm not ready to announce that yet. I'm happy that you guys asked, but a few things are clear. One, I love Chicago, so it's going to be focused on Chicago, and I love education. And so that's what I'm going to be focused on in my next act. I also am a parent of, CPS students. And so continuing to be involved and advocate is going to be incredibly important for me as well. So more to come on that.
TBD. Got it.
Yeah. All right. All right.
I think we have time for questions. We have had, thank you. That's been a fantastic conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know from the questions in the chat and the questions in the Q&A that people want to hear Dr. Jackson, all of the information you have. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about lots of specific mm-hmm. questions here. So we're going to go ahead and begin our question and answer period. First question comes from Jonathan Feinstein, and he says he wants to know what's been Chicago Public Schools' biggest success or like process, maybe I think it's probably more about process in retaining strong leaders and principals. So what has been maybe the secret sauce in that? How about that question?
Yeah, I think it's been, I mentioned it earlier, the public-private partnership. So we have a partnership with the Chicago Public Education Fund. And through that partnership, there's a focus on the entire continuum of the principal's life, right? We made a bet that this is the area we have to focus. So number one was attracting and recruiting and placing principals, supporting them while they're in their roles, and retaining them. And what I've seen in a lot of districts, some of them don't have any of those pieces in place. It's rare to see all of them in place. In the Bush Institute, Jonathan, just to point you to a resource, the Bush Institute has a framework for, this entire continuum that, and they rate districts on it, and they also provide technical support. But I think that we've done that on the recruitment side. We partnered with universities and programs here. So University of Illinois at Chicago, where I actually went, produces a lot of our principals. Principals can obviously go through traditional programs. We have universities like National Louis, Teach for America, the Harvard program. So there are a variety of places where we work directly with them to train. The other piece that's unique to CPS is that you have to have eligibility to be a principal. So we have about 8,000 employees in CPS that have credentials to be a principal. They have the state licensure, but we have an additional step around eligibility. We created competencies. People go through a process and have to demonstrate that competency. And then because we have a decentralized process for selecting principals, we actually have like mini school boards for each school. They're called local school councils. They actually pick the principals. And so we wanted to ensure that the individuals that they were selecting from met the core competencies. And so that, to me, that process, and again, this is 15 years in the making, that process has led to us having stronger principals and actually retaining and supporting them longer.
Thank you. Here's a question from Jay Shawanda. I think I'm signing, connects to this question about sort of community support. And her question was, what are specific strategies used in CPS to galvanize philanthropic groups?
Well, we actually have a great degree of support in that area. Again, another one of the ingredients in this recipe is that there is a lot of civic as well as philanthropic support for what happens in the city. And I think that's critically important. So anybody leading in a district trying to achieve that makes a lot of sense. And we have our own separate, well, CPS, I keep saying we, but it'll always be we. CPS,
that's right. We is okay. I think they will forever consider their family. So it's okay.
Good. And I am a graduate. So
that's right. So it is we. That's right.
It is we. Yep. But I forgot what I was saying. Oh, no, we have a separate 501c3 where we raise money, but we've had a lot of support. All of the initiatives that I've talked about, there's usually a philanthropic connection to it. And so I would encourage people to look at, it's called Children First Fund. If you Google that, you can see how it's organized and how we try to, organize ourselves to ask for different resources to support the children in CPS.
Okay. Here's a question from Abigail Klein. In your experiences, and you kind of touched on this, but I think what people are wanting, and I think this is so traditional in education, they want the give me the top 5 things, right? So I think this is where this question might be headed. Yeah. But we're thinking about, in your experiences, what kind of specific support do you think are necessary to help retain principals?
First, you have to make sure you attract people who are qualified for the role. That's why I said it's not a one thing, it's a continuum, and it's sequential, right? The first step is people, you need to make sure people are qualified to do it. And you also have to help people pick the right schools that complement their needs and the complement, amongst the team, et cetera. I think the other thing is retaining principals. I haven't heard a lot about other districts who spend as much time doing that. So a couple of things we do. One, we wanted to get principals more involved in the policy formation process. In most districts, principals are just the implementers of policy. And I remember we had a CEO who said, if you don't like policy, you can change it in 45 days. And he was saying it off the, off the cuff, right? Yeah, but it was actually true. It takes a little longer to change it. But what he was saying is that all of these things can be changed if we go through the process. We have a board, work through that process. And so one of the things we wanted to do was formally bring principals in that process. I used to write these long, dramatic emails as a principal, and I could change policy. Like I would point that out, but we shouldn't rely on some principal who has the time and is bold enough to send the superintendent or the mayor something. we have to create a structure like that. And as a result, we have changed and tweaked policy. We now run big initiatives through these groups before. So that's why. And then the other is our program with Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern, where they get executive coaching. And for a lot of our principals, they may be in the role 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and just feeling like they need, a little more motivation. And so going into this executive management program has really helped us retain people. But we've written and talked a lot about that. I would encourage people to go to the Chicago Public Education Fund's website. There are a lot of briefs and different information about all of our efforts.
That's fantastic.
Yes, compensation as well. But what we've learned, because we have such a sophisticated process, compensation is not the most important reason. If it was the most important reason, our teachers would be happy. They're the highest paid in the country.
That's right.
That's not compensation, isn't it? People have to be happy and people have to feel good about their work, feel like there's a vision, feel like they're respected and a part of something. And again, because of our work with the fund, we've learned so much more about things. It's not just about throwing money at people. If the conditions are right, they'll leave anyway.
That's absolutely right. A question from Jim. I want to say his name correctly, Jim DeVore. He says, and Jim, if I mispronounced your name, please forgive me on that. What role, if any, did the Chicago Teachers Union have in the district's sustained progress and success?
Yeah, I think he missed the first part of the introduction, my introductory remarks, where I said I was baffled at the fact that the teachers union leadership would that they were skeptical of the progress when the progress is really attributed to the work of their members. And so my belief has always been that teachers do the heaviest lift. I've had every job across the continuum, and I'll tell everybody, I think like a principal. The hardest job, and my best job was being a principal, but the hardest job was being a teacher. They absolutely did it. But I always make a distinction between classroom teachers, rank and file teachers, almost all of them who show up every day to do great work for kids. I consider union leadership a political organization. So that's a distinction to me. I don't think union leadership played any role in the progress. I think they tried to get in front of it and downplay it and raise suspicion around it. But I think teachers in the classroom are incredibly proud of the work, and they should be, because it's their work and it's the work of our children and their families.
Absolutely. That's unfortunate to have a board, a union whose job it is to work in concert with, actively thwarting. So that's definitely something to be not proud of on their part. Question about curriculum in the book, and you talked about Chicago's voluntary curriculum, and then here you talked about a new curriculum called Skyline. So can you talk a little bit about how you are making choices around curriculum, and then how you are preparing teachers for curriculum, and then how are you helping parents understand curriculum?
Yeah. Well, that's a lot.
Right?
I'll take the parent part at the end. Number one, I feel like parents are so much more connected to what kids are doing in their classrooms now because of the pandemic. And, we know that the pandemic has been disruptive in so many ways. But if there was a bright light, I think as we go back to school, we have to continue to leverage that parental involvement. I heard from so many parents, we heard the frustration and all of that, but I heard from a lot of parents that were like, surprised at the work that their children were doing, books they were reading. I can't tell you how many comments around, I didn't read that book until I was in high school, or I didn't read that book until I was in college, or they're introducing these math concepts too early. And what do you mean? Pre-K should be about this. And it's a good conversation, right? So parents definitely have to be involved in the curriculum and definitely engaged in the early childhood space. And that's an area where we're still working hard to make some traction. CPS's journey, which I'm not going to go through. We could do a whole nother webinar on this.
On that one,
it can be described as loosely coupled. When I was in school, like everybody just kind of did their own thing. And sometimes you had a hit and sometimes you didn't, but that was just schooling. And that's how a lot of school districts are organized. I would say probably around the implementation of Common Core, that's when I started to see the most coherence around what we should or should not be doing in the classroom and at particular grade levels. And like I said, teachers really bought into that. I think they felt like it was a useful tool. And, you know, one of the reasons that I think we saw market gains in student achievement, because it was clear. And then it was also clear that, like, all right, if our students can't access this based on what Common Core is saying, what supports and interventions need to be put in place so that they can get there? The work we've done around Skyline has been, I guess, a dream of both Latanya and I. Latanya, who's the former chief ed officer, who's now the superintendent in Prince William County, is we wanted to produce and leverage technology to do what we see good principals do every day in their schools. I created and opened 2 schools. In both cases, we created and designed our own curriculum because we had that flexibility in CPS. That's a good thing if you have people who understand what they're doing. Right. But in a lot of cases, teachers end up working really hard all Sunday, pulling resources from, and I know they use all these different tools now. I don't even want to tell them what we had to do before all that stuff was online. You're just making this stuff and packaging it.
That's right, and copying it.
Exactly. And it's not and so what we want to do, if you think about the whole instructional core, curriculum is only one piece. Instruction is what they do in a class, and assessment is always left behind. If we provide teachers with a high quality curriculum that they buy into, and they have the flexibility to customize for their students, and they can focus on the instruction and then bring assessment in, I think that that's incredibly important. And so that's why I think the Skyline curriculum that we've created is so important. When we surveyed our teachers, first of all, they overwhelmingly said they want this. Now, nobody wanted it to be mandated, because the minute you mandate something, it's dead on arrival.
That's right. Yeah. It's dead on arrival. It
is very much evidence-based. Anybody who knows me knows I don't put out anything that's not backed up by evidence. So what we did is we worked with publishers, but we did not just allow them to sell us off-the-shelf curriculum, which is what districts have been doing for decades. We then hired 250 of our teachers, also consultants like Goldie Muhammad. I talked earlier about our culturally relevant teaching piece, and we hired them to vet the curriculum and customize it for Chicago Public Schools. It was a $140 million investment, and probably one of the hardest things I had to get approved as a superintendent. But going back to my thoughts earlier, I'm a big believer that we can't program our way out of anything. When we see disparities, the first thing people do is go run and create a program. That's not going to change. Anybody who really knows instruction and knows how people learn and improve, you know, it is about what happens every day on a consistent basis, the habits that we help kids create, et cetera. You know, in most public schools, kids don't produce any authentic piece of learning every day.
That's right. They sure don't.
You can count how many pages of writing they produce a day. You can count how many things they create. And so the curriculum that we put out gives teachers the resources. Here are the standards, here are the lessons. And then now you have more time to pull out the student's individuality. You have more time for assessment because you haven't spent your whole Sunday trying to put lessons together.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Karen, I want to bring you up on this question. It comes from David. I think it's pronounced Coppola. David, if I mispronounced your last name, just forgive me on that. His question is, talk about some commonalities that you found between a large district like Chicago Public Schools and a small district like Steubenville, and then another school like Valley Stream. I know you found some commonalities, which is what strings the book together. So I'd like to hear from you, what are some commonalities that you sort of found?
So I think there are a few things. One is this very clear ability to understand the role of leadership. I think Dr. Jackson is emblematic of the kind of sense of responsibility and the sense of commitment to the schools and the students. So you have this absolute understanding that leaders have a responsibility to students and that they have the power to actually make a difference for students. One of the things that Dr. Jackson just said was, she's not really a program person. If you see a disparity, you want to throw a program at it. And she's, that's not to say she doesn't use programs. That's not to say the voluntary curriculum in some ways is a program, right? But all of them sort of talk in the same kind of way about programs. Some of them, so Steubenville is actually a district that uses school Success for All. So it is a program district. And yet if you talk with Melinda Young, the superintendent, or anybody, any of the leaders and teachers, even though they think it's really, really helpful, they'll say it's not about a program. Their success is not about a program. It's about thinking through every piece of what they do and seeing if a program is helpful in this particular instance or in, you know, or in a different instance, and keeping a constant search on whether what they're doing is effective or not. So that has to do with really kind of using the scientific method. Again, Dr. Jackson just said she doesn't do anything without evidence. None of these people do anything without evidence. And they think deeply about what the research is. And sometimes there's no research answer for what they do. So they think about the research and they say, well, let's try this. But then what they do is they keep going on that scientific method process, which is they look at the data and see if what they did worked. That's actually the hard part of the scientific method, right? It's easy to come up with programs. It's easy to sort of say, oh, well, we have a problem here. Let's do a program. It's much more difficult to sort of say, well, let's try this. Let's look at the data. Did it help? Did it not help? If it did help, let's extend and expand. If it didn't help, let's rethink it. And rethinking is really very difficult. Education is a very personal thing. Every first grade, I shouldn't say every first grade teacher, but first grade teachers in general, they love Charlotte's Web. They want to teach Charlotte's Web. Second grade teachers want to teach Charlotte's Web. Third grade teachers I was in one district once where when they finally sat down and looked at all the books that the teachers were teaching, something like 4 grades were teaching Charlotte's Web, and nobody was teaching, other very important pieces of literature. And it's because they love what they do and they think it's important, but they need to step back and be able to say, well, I love Charlotte's Web, but maybe we should just keep it at one of the grade levels and not at 4 or 5 grade levels. And finally, they pay a lot of attention to reading instruction. They all spend a lot of time thinking about it and making sure that all students learn to read. Some of them come at it with a great deal of knowledge about the science of reading. Seaford, for example, the superintendent there really knew a lot about reading instruction. Others sort of stumble into a knowledge. I think in Chicago, you had for many years, you had Tim Shanahan be the head of early reading instruction for the city of Chicago. I mean, he is a major reading researcher. He understands reading research, and he did a number of programmatic things to improve reading instruction in Chicago. So those 3 things: understanding of the role of leadership, understanding of the scientific method, and a real attention to reading instruction. Those 3 things, if we could get everybody to do those 3 things, I think we'd be able to kind of move forward.
That's fantastic. We are running up on our last 2 minutes, and I want to ask you this question, Karin. It's something you and I have had the pleasure of ruminating about. And the question is, what story needs to be told about Black students that is missing from current news coverage in relation to your book? So don't do that. Don't do that. In relation to your book and not our conversation.
I mean, and I know the story is Black children are brilliant, white children are brilliant, Hispanic children are brilliant. All children have the capacity to be truly deep thinkers, and they are too often not given those opportunities. And it's, you know, Black children are the future. White children are all our children are the future. And if we're not serious about educating all children, I don't know how we're going to get through the next 20 years.
And on that note, that brings us to our close. It has been a fantastic time hearing from you, hearing from Dr. Jackson. Thank you, Alia Wong, for leading the questions. And thank you, everybody who put their questions in the chat and in the Q&A. If we did not get to them, we definitely do apologize for the time. But thank you for everyone. It has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Well, and I just want to say, everybody who listened to this conversation will understand when I say that it took enormous discipline on my part to not just quote Janice Jackson for 150 pages.
I'm sure. I absolutely believe that. I know that's to be true.
But I really think, Alia Wong, you did such a nice job eliciting such wonderful answers from Dr. Jackson. So thank you so much to all three of you. This was a great
And Karen, can I say one thing? Because you're not saying it and I don't know why, but everybody needs to go and read this book. So I will do it. And I will tell you, if you care about this stuff and if you're on the call this late at night, I know that you do. I legit read it like in 2 days because it's a really easy read with really concrete examples. And so the people who were looking for the 3 things, just read it and you're going to find 100. That's it.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.
All right.